Welcome back, Honors. All right, so no editing, no crazy stuff. It's not needed because this is one of my absolute favorite things to talk about in history, bar none. What we're getting into, is the Communist Revolution and Civil War in Russia. So just to give you some context, just to give you a heads up, just so you can understand exactly what's going on, the Russian Revolution is going to take place during and after World War I. What we're going to do is treat this time now to talk about it because it starts during 1917. Now, it has a lot of earlier causes, so we're going to kind of travel back in time a little bit and go even to before World War I so you can understand loosely where this whole thing came from, because I absolutely refuse to not teach about this concept. It is one of the best things you'll ever learn about. It's super neat, and it even relates to y'all on a regular everyday level, because many of you have seen films like Anastasia. Anastasia being based off the Romanov daughter. And the villain in that film, Rasputin, which we'll talk about here in a few minutes. So, Revolution and Civil War in Russia. Many of you even understand the symbol that is sitting right here in front of your face. So really, really quick, do me a favor. Screenshot it, copy it, draw it, do what you want to do, but that right there is going to be the symbol that defines the Russian Revolution. That right there is the symbol of Russian communism. That right there is going to be the thing that gives you a guiding light understanding this revolution in a sense before we go any further. Now, first of all, just so you know, that symbol was adopted in 1922, so long after the guys we're about to talk about, long after the death of the Romanovs, spoiler alert, long after a lot of this converted stuff, but following the end of the Civil War in Russia and their completion of their revolution, that symbol is going to be adopted. I'm not saying it came out beforehand. I'm just saying it gives you kind of a nice little chapter overview of what we're getting into. Some of your parents, if they're seeing this right now, they've seen that symbol before because they were alive when it was still used. I was alive when it was still used. The USSR, or the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the product after their revolution and civil war, dissolved in 1991, I think. Let me double check. USSR dissolved in 1991, the day after Christmas, December 26, 1991. So, getting further into it, though, this symbol is very indicative of this revolution. It is a sickle and a hammer. Reason why? Because the communist revolution was supposed to show the uprising of the working class of society and the collectivization of the means of production. The means of production being recognized by two factors of the economy. The agricultural section, which is represented in the sickle, showing the agricultural sector or the farmers, and the industrial section, or the hammer, showing the beating of steel and the pounding of hammers in industrial factories of the era. It's one of my favorite symbols that history has ever produced just because I think it looks kind of clean and neat. I'm not saying I like communism because it's not really a good idea. It's a great idea on paper, but it doesn't really motivate anybody to do anything, so it's never going to actually work. And also, fun fact, it's never worked. Communism has never been achieved. The only time communism has ever existed in its truest sense was in tribal communities, pre-industrialization, pre-large civilization. Ever since the invention of farming, communism has never existed. Not successfully, anyway. Well, attempts at it have existed, but it's never truly existed. So we got to talk about causes. How did we get here? Where are we coming from? Where are we going? What were the causes of the Russian Revolution? Well, let's go ahead and go into it, shall we? Where it is going to come from, first off, you have to understand the growth of communism and Marxism. Now, what these things are political theories. So these became very popular in the 1800s during the Industrial Revolution. You might want to jot that down somewhere. It's very, very important. It's very important also for you as honors kids to understand the origin of socialism and communism. Getting further into it, though, socialism and communism are going to rise up post-industrial revolution. due to the fracturing and creation of new social classes after the Industrial Revolution. The feudal era is dead. We now have the industrial classes of the upper class, the industrial middle class or factory owners, and the industrial working class or the lowest class. Now, going with this, socialism is going to be the first one that pops up. It's kind of like a chicken or egg situation, except we know exactly which one came first, and it's socialism. Socialism is going to be the first thing that pops up. And as we already know, socialism has a few key tenets. The key tenets include decreasing the gap between the wealthy and poor, limiting or abolishing private property, universal suffrage, redistribution of wealth, and social welfare programs are key in socialist ideas. Socialism is still very prevalent in our political theories today. It is even prevalent in our American economy and our American political structure, despite what people would like to let you know. We happen to be one of the most top, well, not the most, we're one of the top 20 socialist, one of the top 20 socialist trait-bearing countries in the world, because it's a beauty of blending the socialist theory and capitalism together, and America does a pretty solid job of it. Now, social welfare programs that exist in our common day society include public schooling or access to education for all, disaster relief, or access to relief efforts from a government should something happen, for example, like Hurricane Katrina. Law enforcement, as in police officers and firefighters, are going to be an element of a socialist community, and health care, as in having access to it. Now, in our country and community, we use the programs such as Medicare and Medicaid and a variety of other tactics, I guess is the word I'll use there, to try and make sure everyone receives some type of health care if they actually apply for it. And sometimes it's not always the best, but it's something that we're currently struggling with. So, but getting further into it, though, if socialism didn't exist, we wouldn't have any of those things, like public schooling, disaster relief, law enforcement, healthcare, ideals, universal suffrage. It would instead be ran by a complete capitalist sense, which is like survival of the fittest and privatization of everything, which there's no way that can actually happen. So, again, I'm not advocating for socialism. Do not run off and tell your parents I'm a socialist, because that's not true at all. I'm just showing you that there are elements of it in our society. So going forward, though, communism is going to be born of that. So I'm going to take that little gray gap right there, and I'm going to use it to cover up those like socialist ideas, so I can show you that these two things are separate from the other. Because out of socialism, communism is going to be born. And what that is, it's an intensified version of socialism, pioneered by a German philosopher and his partner, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Now, Karl Marx is this guy right here. Friedrich Engels is his buddy right there. Karl Marx is the Santa Claus to Friedrich Engels' elf. So, as you understand further, basically I'm not saying he looks like Buddy the Elf. Bye, Mr. Narwhal. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying that Karl Marx is the main contributor of most of these ideas. Friedrich Engels happens to be one of his lead what's the word I'm looking for? Lead editors or reviewers or peers. So with this, though, these two men are going to begin to look at the industrial society and notice the gaps that it is creating between the wealthy and the poor and the quality of life limitations of the industrial poor working class. And they are going to write down their thoughts and theories in a book, and that book is called the Communist Manifesto, which is 156 pages and was originally published in 1848. Now, the problem with its publishing early on, when it was published in 1848, it wasn't very widely circulated. It wasn't very popular. It did not begin to gain popularity until the late 1880s going into the 1900s, when these ideas began to grow. Because industrialism brought schooling and increased literacy rates, so workers began to get a hold of these ideas, read them for themselves, and adopt and understand them on their own. Now, we got to talk about the key ideas of communism inside the Communist Manifesto. And the reason why we're talking about this is because the guy that ends up leading the Russian Revolution, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, is going to be a communist in and of himself. Sort of. He's technically a Leninist. And the reason why I have Marxism in quotes is Marxism is like the leading thought theory behind communism, and a lot of other guys have taken his ideas and then twisted them a little bit on their own. That's why a lot of people reverse of Vladimir Lenin's ideas as Leninism, or Trotsky's ideas, Trotskyism, or Chairman Mao's ideas as Maoism. So anyway, going further, the key ideas of communism are as follows. A big one is class consciousness. Not Vladimir Lenin. Karl Marx argues that in the Industrial Revolution, it may have brought advancement, but it also brought a sense of knowing, a sense of understanding of what class you were in. And the poor and the wealthy had begun to become very, very aware or conscious of their class. Now, he broke down the two main classes into the proletariat and the bourgeois. Sorry, I'm laughing. My dog is having a dream and he's wagging his tail, so it must be a good one. So anyway, proletariat being the working class. So underneath proletariat, go ahead and jot down the working class. First, the bourgeois. And the bourgeois are the leading ruling class or the wealthy class. So he believed that you had to abolish these social classes. And one of the only ways to do that was to collectivize the means of production. Now, the means of production are examples of things like factories or agriculture or large farms or factories, right? So the means of production are how things are made and created in an economy. So he believed that that needed to be collectivized, not owned by single people, but owned by entire communities and entire governments as a collective, that the workers in the factory own the factory, not somebody who owns the building and profits off their labor. You have to understand, labor is a big, big, big key component of Marxist theories. He has once said that profits are just stolen labor, as in the man who holds the hammer makes the things in the factory, and if a guy in an office upstairs makes the money off of his labor, he is basically ripping him off. So in the collectivization of the means of production, he believed that you had to abolish monetary systems, so a communist utopia would have no money whatsoever, the abolishment of private property, so no one technically owns anything because we're all sharing in a community sense, and then also a violent revolution had to take place. So he believes, Karl Marx believes, that the proletariat will eventually rise up, take up arms, and destroy their bourgeois overlords, etc., etc., etc. Now, many attempts of this have happened, but none of them have ever been really, truly successful. The Russian one is the closest thing to one, and the Chinese one is the closest thing to one. So going forward, though, he also believed after the violent revolution, you had to have an abolishment of religion. You had to have, because he believed it was the opiate of the masses, which is ridiculous. So he also believed in the establishments of councils of workers to help control the means of production. And if any of them got too snide or tried to make money on their own, those councils could be recalled and revoted at any single moment. Universal suffrage is a big key component of communism, and the state, quote unquote, the state or a government body only exists to shelter people and make sure that no one is truly taking anything extra over top of anybody else. That right there was a crash course in communism. But those ideas begin to grow, and the big place that they end up to grow and spread is in a dying czarist state. So what am I talking about here? I'm talking about the death of Tsarism in Russia. So in Russia, they have a czar, and their czar is known as Nicholas II. He is a Romanov. Make sure you have that name. It's another famous family we always got to know. The Romanovs. Now, the Romanovs have been in power since Michael Romanov from 1613. They've been in power for over 300 years. So the Romanovs, very famous one we've talked about in the past, Peter the Great. Peter the Great is the Romanov. Another big famous married into Romanov is a woman named Catherine the Great. She technically wasn't Romanov, she married into the family, but still. So anyway, the Nicholas II, though, becomes the czar, or is the czar absolutist as of 1896 to 1917. When he became czar, he followed several other different leaders. One of them in particular happened to be a guy named Alexander II, who was considered very, very popular and very, very progressive. However, his assassination leaves a lot of his tactics undone. So his weak, ineffective, possibly not smart method of ruling over Russia, using his secret police and his goals of hyper-industrialization, really lead Russia down a bad path. So you need to understand and remember, he is weak, he is ineffective, he is possibly not smart. I'm sorry, I love this picture. I found it online, it's one of my favorites. Crown instructions, place on head and rule. So, because that's kind of what he reminds me of. He's just not that bright. He didn't even know how to run his own coronation ceremony, which we'll talk about here in a second. So, the secret police was going to try and help him out that he used to try and snuff out anybody that didn't believe what he believed, and he tried to hyper-industrialize Russia, as in tried to put up as many factories as much as possible and grow Russia in an economy state state as fast as quick as possible. And this is a picture of him right there. That is Nicholas II. Many historians have questioned his intelligence, saying he's of middling intellect, maybe. So going further, though, this Romanov man, who is also probably inbred as well, but we're not going to talk about it, he also happens to be a cousin of Kaiser Wilhelm II, and he is a cousin of George V, the King of England during this time period. So the workers in these factories, since they have hyper-industrialized Russia, have began to work tireless hours, and they began to work at extreme rates, and they are not being paid adequate money. There is no such thing as a minimum wage during this time period. So due to this fact, these workers, or the proletariat, according to Marx, believe that they're being mistreated, and they believe that he doesn't care about their, dying, starvation, disease that they can contract. And also, if they end up getting hurt on the job, they are fired and they lose their means of creating monetary systems for their families. And the sad part is they're right. He does not care. He does not care even a little bit. Also, the former serfs, because in 1861, that guy I talked about a second ago, Alexander II, the former Tsar of Russia, freed the serfs in 1861, and they did not modernize as quickly as they would like. Most people were hoping that they would demand to grow their farms and collectivize them together and figure out ways to produce more food for the country. They didn't do that. They ended up producing a lot of food for each other, and then most people went hungry in the cities. So they weren't modernizing or producing farm goods, leading to low food supplies. Now, an example of his not caring was in the Kabinka Tragedy. Let me make sure I'm pronouncing that right. Kabinka. Yeah, the Kabinka Tragedy. Maybe I'm just trying to pretend like I don't know how to pronounce it because I'm actually Russian. Russian spy theory, still alive. Now, this right here is the Kabinka Tragedy. This is at his coronation ceremony. Over over 500,000 people showed up to his coronation ceremony when he was going to be crowned Emperor of Russia. 500,000 people. And the reason why they showed up is because they thought it was going to be a party. They were told by rumors on the streets that you're going to get beer and pretzels and a cup, and that cup may or may not have a gold coin in the bottom that you can sell and make more money off of, and blah, 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 blah. And so 500,000 people show up hoping to get beer and pretzels and a cup. And then when they started getting kind of unruly because a rumor was going around that they ran out of beer and pretzels, everybody started freaking out, and then the police showed up, and then a mass stampede happened, and over 100 people were trampled to death. That was at Nicholas II's coronation ceremony, because they ran out of beer and pretzels. It's crazy. Now, also, another reason why he's not that popular happens to go in line with a war he tried to fight soon after adopting rule. And about 9 years after his rule, in 1896 when he takes over, he decides that he wants to try and win a quick war against Japan in the Russo-Japanese War. Now, he decides he wants to have a war with Japan because he wants trade ports and access to trade ports in areas of Manchuria and northern China and Korea as well. So they establish a foothold, but then they are attacked by the Japanese. Now, the Japanese are believed to still be a backwards community who aren't modern, and this should be an easy war for Russia to win, right? Not. Nicholas II went into this thing thinking he would win an easy war, promote national pride, give a war to this people, create more jobs, create more goods, and actually make more money for the empire. However, they lost in embarrassing fashion. Embarrassingly bad. They lost a naval war and a ground war to the Japanese, who had modernized as late as 1865. They had started modernizing due to American integration, but whatever. So the Russians were wrong. The Japanese were modern enough to actually stop them, and so they lost that in an embarrassing fashion. And what's going to happen? Riots are going to ensue, because Bloody Sunday is going to happen. In 1905, jot this down real quick, in 1905, there was a small, ineffective revolution in Russia. In 1905. A small one, a little tiny one, that just kind of showed that Tsarism was not going to rule the day. And the biggest event that happened in that small Russian Revolution of 1905 was known as Bloody Sunday, when 150,000 people assembled out front of the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, called St. Petersburg for now. They're going to change the name of St. Petersburg to Petrograd in 1914 because it sounds more Russian. But anyway, so in the palace in St. Petersburg, that is the Winter Palace, the equivalent of the Palace of Versailles in Russia, built in a very similar style, Baroque, Rococo. Now, anyway, to give a petition to Nicholas. They were being led by a priest, and they had signatures and a petition demanding food and understanding and better needs for the poor. When they showed up, a small contingent of military showed up, and Nicholas ordered the royal guard to fire on them, shooting over 200 peaceful protesters in the street. And riots are going to ensue because of that. Riots are going to break out all over Russia because of this event. And these riots, though, are going to have a little bit of result. So this was still an ineffective revolution. But the results of the 1905 revolution are a legislative body called the Duma. Yay! They get a legislative body like the U.S. Congress or the British Parliament that Nicholas can dismiss whenever he feels like, ugh. And they got voting rights. Yay! More people can vote after 200 people lost their lives. But Nicholas is still an absolutist, so he doesn't have to listen to the votes. And they got a constitution! Yay! But Nicholas can ignore it whenever he feels like it. So, as you can tell, this weak and ineffective revolution, yes, it set up a very, very nice little legislative body, which everybody wants, and it's called the Duma, and you need to make sure you have the Duma, because they come up again a little bit later when they create the provincial government. But anyway, the voting rights thing, it was all a big farce, because Nicholas could do whatever he wanted still. Democracy, I guess, right? So, now, going forward, though, don't jot this down yet. Don't jot that down yet. World War I is going to break out, all right? So 10 years later, well, technically 9 years later, technically 8 years later, following the 1905, Russia is going to become a police state. It's been ran mostly by its military, and Nicholas was going to put down anyone that questioned him. But the problem that's going to ensue is that World War I is going to break out. So following the 1905 revolution, in 1914, he decides he's going to go to war, hoping that it will again encourage national pride and grow the industry and grow their borders, and they will be able to gain from this large war. Problem is that, remember we talked about how they just modernized like 5 minutes ago? Well, many soldiers didn't even have guns, all right? So, like, a lot of soldiers had no guns, no ammo, no boots, no uniform. And by 1915, over 2 million Russian soldiers had already died in World War I. Many more of them were deserting. If you go back to the last flip that I showed you, there's a pie chart on there showing World War I. Actually, I'll show you real quick. And right there, yeah. This right here is a pie chart of the deaths and casualties of World War I. Notice, again, it is a pie chart of this stuff. Now, that right there, 32% of all casualties in World War I came from Russia. So as you can tell, they were severely hurt, and they weren't even in it for the entire extent of the war. So during this entire thing, stupid Nicholas decides that he is going to go off to the front line and lead the army in 1915, because that's what it's missing. 2 million Russian soldiers are dying because Nicholas isn't up there. He was kind of dumb in the first place. Well done, sir. So he decides he's going to go off to the front lines to help out. This goes south because he has left no one behind to lead other than his wife. And the person in charge is going to be his wife, the Tsarina, whose name is Alexandra, and her close personal advisor, wink, Grigory Rasputin. Just to give you a heads up, that is the Tsarina Alexandra right there. But Rasputin, there's a great story that you're going to need to listen to. You don't have to write it down, just listen to it. Rasputin is going to be assassinated by royalists who blame him for failures in World War I. And just to give you a really quick thing, drum roll please, that is Rasputin right there. Like he hasn't showered like ever. All right, just to give you a heads up of who Rasputin is, this is one of my favorite stories ever. You can jot down little bits and pieces of this. It will definitely be an essay question on your test, just kind of talking about how the legacy of Rasputin kind of leads into the Russian Revolution. Also, it's just a fun story that you should kind of just buckle up and listen to. So anyway, good gravy. It's crazy, all right? Rasputin is a Russian mystic priest, born in Siberia, don't remember when, but it was a long time ago, because he was of much older age by the time he became a counsel or advisor to the royal family. So Rasputin, as a young boy, apparently received communications from God, saw angels in his dreams, and could heal people, and also somehow knew all kinds of crazy stuff about his neighbors that no one could possibly know. I think he was just probably a creep and was probably spying on them all the time. But that's neither here nor there. So anyway, like Rasputin starts to earn a reputation as someone who has been touched by God, right? He's been a mystic ever since his young childhood. Also, fun fact, he is one of 8 children to his mother and father, and he is the only one that survived, which is absolutely crazy, because Siberia is a hard place to live in. So when he gets older, he starts roaming around. Well, he does get married, and he has some kids in that little area, but he starts roaming around, and he eventually becomes a priest. Now, when he becomes a priest, he gets a lot of crazy, intense ideas. He starts joining up with several different cults, one of them called like the Kaczynskis or the Kabinkas. I can't remember what it's called. It starts with a K, who are really nuts and go into the woods and strangle each other. Not to kill each other, but to the point of almost passing out so they can feel loopy and weird, and then they spin until they're almost drunk, and they have a bunch of weird cult ceremonies and stuff. But he's a super weird dude. So he's also still revered as a mystic healer. Everyone believes he's like some kind of witch doctor, right? Everyone in Siberia. And so he starts traveling around again. He makes some friends that are also priests, and he becomes an Eastern Orthodox monk. Now, one fun fact about him, as you can tell, he is gross looking. Even though, ironically enough, he had a lot of female fans, which I'm not getting into on the internet. Just so you know, though, he never showered or bathed. It was something weird about his monk-following cult thing. They believe that you shouldn't shower, that you should just be spending your days trying to hurt yourself and purge yourself of sin. He sometimes would wear shackles around different areas that he was traveling to put himself into physical pain. So as he's doing all of this, he starts getting in tight with some of the other Russian higher-ups. He starts getting in tight with some of the other Russian Orthodox leaders, and he starts getting recommended and connected to a lot of other people above him. Now, he ends up meeting these 2 girls who introduce him to the Tsarina at a party. And in this joint shot right here, you have the Tsarina right here, and you have, little Alexi. Now, the Tsarina has heard a lot of these crazy rumors about Rasputin being a mystic healer. Now, keep in mind, I am skipping over a bajillion details, because if I was to give you this whole thing, it would take at least a whole class period to tell you the entire Rasputin story. But anyway, getting into it. So the Tsarina, right, the queen right here, hears about him, and they invite him to a party. Now, this is before Nicholas has went off to the front line. So Nicholas is waiting around. They're at a party. They're like, oh, that's that creepy weird dude who apparently heals all the people and blah, 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 and apparently goes into the woods and screams and freaks out. He's also a raging alcoholic, and he also frequents a lot of women dens. A lot. That's what we'll call him. So anyway, Rasputin, unsavory character, and apparently smells terrible. But the Tsarina and the Tsar hear these rumors about how he's a healer. Because here's the kicker. Because a lot of you are wondering to yourself, why would that matter? Why is that such a big deal? Who flippin' cares? Why would the king and queen of Russia decide to listen to some crazy nutbag who probably doesn't even really know how to heal people? It's because of their son. Now, they don't tell him at this party, but their son, Alexi, has a genetic disorder known as hemophilia. This is a portrait of the young Alexi, the prince, the crown prince, the next in line to take the Russian throne, Alexei Romanov. He is slated to be taking over, but many people do not think he's going to live to see adulthood because of this disease he has, hemophilia. Hemophilia is a disease where your blood does not have the necessary hemoglobin or matrixing devices to cause it to clot. And that means that you can get a scratch or a bruise, and you could bleed to death in a short amount of time. Now, apparently, Alexi one day has an injury, right? Now, they had met each other at this party, and when he gets hurt, he is bleeding. Now, some say it's like a scrape on his knee, some say it was a cut on his arm, some say I've heard that he tripped down some stairs. So, apparently, though, Rasputin storms into the royal palace and says, I knew I was sent by God to save this young man. And he shoos the doctors away, and he takes Alexi into a small room, and then he remerges with Alexi, and Alexi has stopped bleeding. Now, to this day, many historians argue on what he probably did or didn't do. Some historians argue that they probably just prevented Alexi from getting aspirin that his doctors wanted to give to him, but aspirin thins your blood, so it would have made your bleeding worse. More than likely what happened is Rasputin might have hypnotized him or calmed him down enough to get his heart rate to slow down enough so his blood could have the time to clot. I don't give it into this garbage that he's some kind of weird mystic devil healer, but whatever. So he ends up earning a very, very close reputation with the Tsar and the Tsarina. Now that is Nicholas II right there. That's the Tsarina, and that's the creepy Rasputin sitting up behind him. Now he ends up getting in super super tight with them, and he actually becomes like their quote-unquote mystic healing doctor. Now, the Tsar and the Tsarina have their own health problems and stuff. The Tsar always suffers from headaches. The Tsarina has anxiety and also gets migraines as well. So whenever he would actually show up, he would prescribe them treatments. Now, these treatments were oftentimes in the form of cocaine, opioids, because remember the opiate of the masses, remember opium, remember that back in the day? And morphine. And he would give them these things, saying that these will be the things that make you feel better. These are my healing products. Yeah, so the Tsar and the Tsarina are now also being advised by a creepy mystic drug dealer, all right? So they become addicted to his goods, and he actually starts giving them all these ideas, and they believe that he is like sent by God, right? Like there's all these crazy stories about him, absolutely wild stories. Like for example, in 1914, one of the guys that recommended that he meet the Tsar and the Tsarina was like, you're being a terrible person. You're sleeping around with all these employed ladies. You have this creepy cult in your apartment where all these people have left their husbands and they're coming to hang out with you. This is weird. And he beats him up in the street with a crucifix. And then he goes and tattles to the Tsarina. And then, like, that guy gets banished to Finland. So, like, then he also, at one point, a woman without a nose, with a hole in her face, like, tried to stab him to death in the streets. And apparently reached into his stomach, ripped his guts out. And then, like, apparently he still lived. It's crazy. It's absolutely insane, all the stuff that surrounds this guy. Now, Rasputin, though, ends up earning this reputation and gets very in tight with the Tsar and the Tsarina. Now, remember, though, Nicholas went off to the front lines to go fight in World War I. So when he was gone, he was the direct advisor to the Tsarina. Many people begin to believe that he's overreaching his power. He has created a new, like, systematic thing where he is basically in charge of the Russian government now. And a lot of people are like, he's the reason why we're losing World War I. We're blaming him for it. He's dealing and dicing. He probably sent Nicholas off to the front line. He's probably telling the Tsarina to do all this dumb stuff. It's his fault. So this guy, Felix, I think it's Yursanov, whatever his last name is, Felix is a royal, or not royal, but he is a cousin of the royal family, and he is inside the Russian government. And he decides it's time for Rasputin to die. But legit die this time. We're not going to beat him in the street with a crucifix. We're not going to stab him a bunch of times and pull his guts out because he's just going to figure out a way to heal, apparently. Word on the street is when he did get stabbed by that lady without a nose, apparently he shoved his guts back in and walked to a hospital because this was after he got beat up with a crucifix and he went to vacation in Siberia for a little while. But he ends up healing. So when Rasputin is around, everybody knows that he's, like, into some weird stuff, right? Like, some really weird stuff. This creepy mystic healing and all this other stuff. So Felix invites Rasputin over to heal his wife because he believes his wife has a mental disorder. And so he's like, oh, I want you to meet my wife and I want you to heal her. So I want you to come over while we're having a party so you can meet her, so you can meet my friends, and we'll do that. It'll be nice. Now, he invites Rasputin over, but then he says to Rasputin, hey, why don't you come down into my basement? I have a beautiful parlor room, and we will eat tea cakes and drink wine and hang out together, right? And we'll just chill out. Now, it turns out that the tea cakes, the wine, and all the food that he was being fed were laced with cyanide, potassium cyanide, a caustic poison that will kill a human in a very short amount of time, almost instantly. Rasputin is eating these cakes. He's drinking over 2 bottles of wine full of cyanide. And 3 hours go by, and he's just, oh yeah, what's up? And the Felix is flabbergasted. He's like, how could anybody drink that much cyanide and still be alive? So he gets really flustered and angry. And he tells Rasputin, he's like, hey, why don't you stay down here and check out this crucifix I got. It's really sweet. It's a big gold one. Check that out. Why don't you just stare over there? And he runs upstairs, and he grabs a revolver out of the kitchen. He goes back down into the basement, and he says, hey, Rasputin, what's up? Rasputin turns around and stares him in the face. Doesn't beg for his life. Doesn't do any of that stuff. His word on the street is he predicted that he was going to be assassinated 2 weeks before that, which is another creepy thing about Rasputin. But regardless, so he turns back and he looks at him, doesn't beg for his life at all, and Felix just goes, cow, and he shoots him in the chest. And Rasputin collapses to the ground, right? Collapses down to the ground and just lays there motionless. Kind of like my dog right now, just like sitting there, laying there motionless. And so Felix decides, like, all right, So let's go get a doctor. Let's go get a couple of my buddies. Let's make sure he's dead. And then we're going to make sure we're ready to go get rid of this dead body. Because we can't just have this thing lying around in my basement. It's weird. So he decides to go get the doctor. And the doctor goes downstairs with Felix. And they go down there to check his pulse. And the doctor is like, I don't know if I see or feel anything. And all of a sudden, Rasputin's eyes open up. And he jumps up. And the doctor faints because he's like, what is going on? This guy was supposed to be dead. And then Felix and him get into a fist fight. And he's sitting there banging Felix's head into the ground. And he's just like, oh, crap. And then Felix runs up the stairs. And Rasputin chases after him with a bullet hole in his chest. And then they end up in a courtyard outside of his house. Rasputin stumbles out. Felix's 4 buddies come out, all brandishing revolvers, and they all start shooting him at point-blank range. Several shots. Some reports say 4, some reports say 20. We don't really know. Nothing we know of this is for sure. It's all Felix's accounts of what happened and the men that were there. I like to believe that some of it happened, though, because it's crazy. Now, I have heard some accounts, too, that they shot him in the head as well, just to make sure he was dead. And then they wrapped him up in a blanket and a carpet, and they drove out to a bridge where there was a hole in the ice, and they tossed him over the river, and they threw him in the ice. Now, this is Rasputin's body after they found him dead after being poisoned and shot multiple times. When they found him, his arms were outside of it, looking as though they were trying to push against the ice, as in there's a chance he was still alive. And that is one of the bullet holes right there in his noggin. Like, this is crazy. All right, so it's absolutely wild. They actually ended up cremating his body later on because they thought if like they bury him somewhere, then like a small cult will show up and all this other stuff. But that is the crazy story of Grigory Rasputin. Some accounts say that he had water in his lungs, so he drowned, which means he was still alive. Other accounts say he didn't. Who's to tell? It's still a crazy story that some creepy Russian Siberian mystic preacher guy managed to infiltrate his way all the way up to one of the strongest military powers in the entire country at the time and advised them using drugs and creepy magic. So, like, it's just one of my favorite stories. He's absolutely wild. The dying of Tsarism is then going to really come to a peak, though, after the death of Rasputin by 1917. People were rioting in Russia again because of the terrible conditions of World War I. Many are deserting, and they're demanding an end to the war that they are obviously losing. So bread riots are going to break out in the streets. People are walking down the streets, rioting for bread and food, demanding that they get their goods. Nicholas, then Bloody Sunday, orders them to fire on the crowd, and instead of doing it, the soldiers join the protests. So the February Revolution officially begins in 1917. So we're going to stop here, and then we're going to pick this up on Tuesday. I'll see you guys later. Y'all have a good one.